I'm holding the phone as my son says I'm not welcome to Christmas, the heater humming beside me like nothing just broke. Still, I don't argue, just lower my hand slowly, feeling the warmth turn hollow in the room we once shared. As the hum keeps going, I realize this isn't about dinner. It's about years where father and son spoke without listening. While that sound fills the silence, I see how pride taught us distance and silence taught us resentment. The same hum reminds me love doesn't disappear. It just waits for someone brave enough to face the truth. That's when I decide this ends with me choosing forgiveness, not to save him, but to finally free myself. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The phone rang just after sunset when the house had settled into its usual evening silence. Harold was sitting in his recliner, the soft hum of the heater filling the room, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling on the side table. He stared at the phone for a moment before answering, already knowing who it was. David rarely called anymore. When he did, it was usually brief, efficient. Never like this, never at night. "Dad," David said, his voice tight, like he was holding something back. Harold straightened in his chair. "David, everything all right?" There was a pause, too long. Harold could almost hear his son weighing his words, rearranging them, deciding what not to say. Yeah, everything's fine." Another pause. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something." Harold's chest warmed instantly. An old, foolish hope stirred before he could stop it. "Of course," he said, trying to sound casual. "What's going on?" "Well, Christmas is coming up." David cleared his throat. "Laura and I were doing dinner at the house this year, just family." He hesitated. "I was wondering if you'd like to come." For a second, Harold couldn't speak. The words landed heavier than they should have, pressing against memories of empty holidays and polite excuses. "I'd like that," he said, his voice softer now. "I'd really like that." "Good," David replied quickly, almost too quickly. "Yeah, good." Harold smiled, though no one could see it. In his mind, he was already picturing the table, the smell of food, the sound of his grandchildren laughing somewhere down the hall. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the opening he'd been waiting for. "It'll be nice," Harold said. "We haven't all been together in a while." "Right," David said. His tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The warmth drained out, replaced by something guarded. "We'll keep it simple, nothing big." "That's fine," Harold replied, confused but careful. "Whatever works for you." Another silence crept in, heavier this time. Harold sensed something unspoken hovering between them, like a door left half open. "Laura knows, right?" Harold asked gently. "Yeah," David said, though the answer came a beat too late. "She knows." The conversation limped forward after that, awkward and clipped. David mentioned a time, mentioned parking, mentioned traffic, as if logistics could cover the growing distance in his voice. By the time he said goodbye, his tone had gone cold, businesslike. "See you then," David said. "Looking forward to it," Harold replied, even though doubt had already begun to settle in his gut. The line went dead. Harold stared at the phone, his reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. He felt lighter and heavier all at once, hope tangled with something he couldn't quite name. He told himself he was overthinking it. David was busy. Life was complicated. Christmas was stressful for everyone. In the days that followed, the invitation replayed in Harold's mind on a loop. As he folded laundry, as he walked through the quiet grocery store aisles, as he sat alone at night with the television murmuring in the background, he found himself drifting backward into memories he usually avoided, arguments that ended without resolution, words spoken too sharply, pride that had kept him from apologizing when he should have. He remembered David as a boy standing stubbornly in the driveway, refusing help. He remembered years later that same stubbornness turning into distance. Harold told himself he had done his best. He had provided. He had shown up. But regret has a way of slipping into the smallest cracks, and now it was everywhere. By the week before Christmas, Harold began preparing as if the dinner were already a test he couldn't afford to fail. He picked out a sweater instead of his usual jacket. He rehearsed what he would say and what he wouldn't. No advice, no criticism, just gratitude, just peace. Still at night, that unease returned. A quiet, persistent dread that sat in his chest and refused to move. The invitation felt fragile now, like it could disappear with a single wrong step. On the morning he planned to confirm the details, Harold stood by the window, watching the street outside, his reflection faint in the glass. He told himself this was his chance to make things right. He just didn't know how easily it could all fall apart. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in a thin, uneasy quiet. Harold had spent the morning moving slowly through his house, checking off small tasks as if they mattered more than they did. The tree stood in the corner, modest and undecorated except for a string of white lights he hadn't bothered to turn on yet. He told himself he'd light them later after the call he was expecting. A quick confirmation, nothing more. The phone rang just after noon. Harold answered immediately. "David." The response came like a strike. "Don't come to Christmas dinner." Harold blinked, certain he'd misheard. "What?" "My wife doesn't want you here," David snapped. The words came out sharp, breathless, like he'd been rehearsing them and finally lost patience. "So don't come." For a moment Harold couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of it blurring as the sentence settled in his chest. "David," he said carefully, gripping the arm of his chair, "what are you talking about?" "I'm telling you not to show up," David said, his voice rising. "Laura doesn't want this drama on Christmas. She's made that clear." "Drama," the word cut deeper than the rest. "Drama," Harold repeated. "I haven't done anything." There was a pause, short but heavy. When David spoke again, his anger had cooled into something colder. "It's not my decision," he said. "I'm just trying to keep the peace." Harold let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "So that's it?" he asked. "After you invited me, after you told me to come?" "You're not listening," David shot back. "Laura's had issues with you for years. This isn't coming out of nowhere." The mention of Laura's name made everything click into place. Harold had always felt her distance, her polite smiles that never reached her eyes. He had ignored it, convinced himself it was nothing. "If she has a problem," Harold said, his voice shaking now, "why didn't anyone talk to me? Why am I hearing this the day before Christmas?" "Because it's not up for discussion," David said flatly. Anger flared, sharp and unfamiliar. "You're my son," Harold said. "This is my family. You don't just uninvite someone from their own Christmas." David exhaled hard. "You always do this," he said. "You make everything about you." Harold felt the sting of that accusation settle deep. "I'm trying to understand," he said. "Tell me what I did wrong, just tell me." Silence answered him. Then quieter, edged with resentment David had kept buried for years. "You wouldn't get it," David said. "You never do." "That's not fair," Harold replied, his voice breaking despite his effort to stay calm. "I've been trying. I've been waiting for a chance." "There it is," David interrupted. "Always about fixing things on your timeline." Harold swallowed hard. "I just wanted to spend Christmas with my family." David didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was distant, resolved. "This is how it's going to be," he said. "I'm not fighting about it." The finality in his tone landed like a door slamming shut. "So that's it," Harold said quietly. "You won't even let me explain." "I've said what I needed to say," David replied. "Please don't come." The line went dead. Harold sat frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. The house felt suddenly too large, too empty, as if the walls had stepped back from him. Slowly, he lowered the phone to his lap, staring at it as if it might ring again and undo everything. His chest ached, not just from the rejection, but from the realization that his son had chosen silence over him. That someone else's resentment mattered more than his place in the family. As the afternoon light faded, Harold remained where he was, replaying every word, every accusation, every pause. Somewhere between shock and grief, one question echoed louder than the rest. Where had he failed so badly as a father? Christmas morning arrived without ceremony. No laughter down the hall, no smell of food drifting from the kitchen. Harold woke before dawn, the house wrapped in a heavy, unnatural stillness. For a few seconds he forgot. Then the memory returned all at once. The phone call, the words, the final click as the line went dead. His chest tightened as he stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet press in from every direction. He moved through the house slowly, as if the day itself might break if he rushed it. The tree stood where he'd left it, lights still off, a silent witness to his mistake in believing he had somewhere else to be. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug for warmth that didn't reach very far. Outside, he could hear distant sounds, cars starting, doors closing, other families beginning their day together. As the morning wore on, memories filled the spaces where people should have been. Harold thought Abo. At the years he'd spent working late, taking overtime shifts so David could go to a better school. He remembered teaching him to drive, staying calm while his own nerves frayed. He remembered the pride he'd felt watching David walk across a graduation stage, believing back then that all the sacrifices had been worth it. But pride had a way of turning rigid. Harold could see that now. He replayed the arguments he and David had never finished, the times he'd chosen silence over apology. At the time, it had felt like strength. Now it felt like distance that had hardened into something unrecognizable. He tried to keep busy. He washed dishes that were already clean. He straightened picture frames on the wall, lingering over old photographs longer than necessary. Each task gave him something to do with his hands, but nothing touched the ache sitting just beneath his ribs. The house remained stubbornly empty, every sound echoing back at him. Late in the morning, his phone rang. Samantha's name lit up the screen. "Dad," she said gently, "I've been trying to reach you." "I'm here," Harold replied, "just taking the day as it comes." She hesitated. "David told me there was some kind of misunderstanding." Harold closed his eyes. "That's one way to put it." "I'm so sorry," Samantha said. "I didn't know he'd do this." He could hear the concern in her voice, but also the distance. She wasn't there, hadn't heard the anger, the finality. "It's fine," Harold lied. "These things happen." "No," she said firmly, "they shouldn't." They spoke for a few minutes more, circling the subject without ever landing on it. Samantha promised to call again later. When the line went quiet, Harold felt the weight of what he hadn't said settle in. Even his daughter didn't fully understand. Maybe no one did. As afternoon slid into evening, Harold picked up the phone again, this time dialing Mark. His old friend answered on the second ring. "Merry Christmas," Mark said, then paused. "You sound tired." Harold told him everything. The invitation, the call, the words that still rang in his ears. Mark listened without interrupting, letting the silence do its work. "That wasn't right," Mark said finally. "Not the way they handled it." "They're young," Harold said automatically, then stopped himself. "No, that's not it." "Laura's been pulling the strings for a long time," Mark said carefully. "And David lets her." Harold didn't argue, he couldn't. The truth of it settled uncomfortably but clearly. "I keep wondering what I did to deserve this," he admitted. Mark sighed. "You're not perfect, Harold, none of us are, but being shut out like that, that's not on you alone." When the call ended, darkness had fallen. Harold sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall as if answers might appear there. He lay down fully dressed, sleep refusing to come. The silence pressed harder now, filled with questions he didn't know how to answer. Somewhere between grief and exhaustion, one thought refused to let him rest. Maybe this wasn't just about Christmas at all. Sleep never truly came. Harold drifted in and out of shallow half-dreams, his mind refusing to let the present rest without dragging the past into it. When morning light finally crept through the blinds, It didn't feel like a new day. It felt like a continuation of something unfinished. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, and memories began to surface uninvited. Not the recent ones, but older, softer moments. David at 6 years old, running across a park with skinned knees and a crooked grin. David falling asleep in the passenger seat after long drives, his small hand clutching the edge of Harold's jacket. Back then, closeness had been effortless. Love had been assumed, not questioned. Even when David had been difficult, Harold had stayed the course. The stubbornness, the slammed doors, the long silences that came with adolescence. Harold had told himself it was a phase, that consistency mattered more than comfort. He'll understand someday, he'd thought. He'll see what I was trying to do. The memory shifted, hardening. David at 16. The night replayed itself with cruel clarity, the raised voices, the accusation in David's eyes. Harold remembered standing in the doorway, tired, frustrated, convinced he was right. He remembered saying things that were meant to correct but landed like punishment. Worst of all, he remembered walking away before the argument was finished, letting pride end the conversation instead of honesty. He had never properly apologized. At the time, Harold had told himself that time would smooth it over, that David would grow up, gain perspective, move on. But lying there now, Harold could see how wrong he'd been. That night hadn't faded, it had fossilized. It had become the first crack, the quiet beginning of the distance that now felt unbridgeable. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face, a heaviness pressing behind his eyes. The estrangement hadn't started with Laura. It hadn't Eve. And started with adulthood. It had started with that moment, one he'd dismissed, one he'd refused to revisit because doing so would have meant admitting he was wrong. Pride, he realized, had been his constant companion, and now it sat beside him, useless. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. Samantha's name flashed again. "Dad," she said when he answered. Her voice was gentle, careful. "I've been thinking about you all night." "I'm fine," Harold said too quickly. "I know you're not," she replied. "You don't deserve what happened." Harold closed his eyes. "It's not that simple." She waited, giving him space to speak. He didn't feel it. He couldn't. The memories were too raw, too close to the surface. "I don't want to talk about it," he said finally. "Okay," Samantha said softly, "but I'm here." After the call ended, Harold sat alone again, the silence heavier than before. Guilt settled in his chest, thick and unwelcome. He could admit his mistake now, at least to himself. He could see how that unresolved moment had shaped everything that followed. And yet beneath the guilt, frustration burned. Because whatever he had done back then, it didn't justify what David was doing now. It didn't excuse being shut out, silenced, erased from his own family. Laura's influence was undeniable, but David was no longer a teenager. He was a grown man making grown decisions. Harold stood and walked to the window, watching the street come alive with normal life. He felt caught between regret and resentment, unsure which one deserved more space. One thing was clear, though. The past wasn't as buried as he'd believed, and it was finally demanding to be faced. Samantha arrived unannounced the following afternoon. Harold heard her knock but didn't move right away. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, the same cup of coffee untouched since morning. When he finally opened the door, she stopped short, her expression shifting as she took him in. "Dad," she said quietly, "you look exhausted." "I'm fine," Harold replied out of habit, stepping aside to let her in. She set her coat down slowly, her eyes scanning the room, the unlit tree, the closed curtains, the air that felt heavier than it should have. "This isn't just about Christmas, is it?" Harold didn't answer at first. He sat back down, rubbing his hands together as if he were cold. Samantha pulled out a chair across from him and waited. She'd always been patient that way. "There was a night," Harold said finally, his voice low, "when David was 16. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We had an argument. I said things I shouldn't have, things I thought would toughen him up. He let out a slow breath. I never apologized, not properly. Samantha nodded, listening. That was a rough year for him, she said, for all of us. I told myself it didn't matter, Harold continued, that he'd get over it. I thought time would take care of it. His jaw tightened. I was wrong. She leaned forward slightly. Dad, it wasn't just that night. Harold looked up at her. You and David have been circling each other for years, she said gently. You both avoid the hard conversations. He pulls away, you shut down. Neither of you ever really says what you're feeling. The truth of it landed heavier than accusation ever could. Harold felt something shift inside him, resistance giving way to recognition. So this, all of this, he said, gesturing vaguely, it's been building. Yes, Samantha said, for a long time. Harold leaned back, the weight of it settling into his chest. David's anger hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing, feeding on silence, misunderstanding, and wounds that never healed. The rejection call hadn't been the cause, it had been the result. Samantha hesitated, then spoke again. There's something else. He waited. David and I aren't close either, she admitted. Not like we used to be. He doesn't call unless he needs something. He barely asks about my life. She gave a small, sad smile. I don't think it's just you, Dad. That stopped him. Harold had always believed the problem was between him and his son alone. Hearing that Samantha felt the same distance forced him to see the pattern more clearly. So it's not just me he's pushing away. No, she said, and Laura, she trailed off. What about her? Harold asked. Samantha chose her words carefully. She's never really dealt with her own family issues. Control makes her feel safe. I think she projects a lot of that onto you. Harold exhaled slowly. It didn't excuse Laura's behavior, but it explained it. And for the first time, he saw how easily David had been pulled into that dynamic, choosing avoidance over confrontation. Silence filled the kitchen again, but this time it felt different, less suffocating. Harold stared down at the table, his reflection faint in the polished surface. He felt regret, yes, but also something else taking shape beneath it. Clarity. I can't keep pretending this will fix itself, he said at last. His voice was steadier now. If I made mistakes, I'll own them, but I won't keep being shut out without understanding why. Samantha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. That's all anyone can ask. Harold nodded slowly. The fear was still there, the risk of being rejected again, of hearing things he didn't want to hear, but beneath it was determination. For the first time since the call, he knew what he had to do. And he knew it wouldn't be easy. Harold waited until evening to make the call. He needed the hours in between to steady himself, to make sure this wasn't anger speaking but intention. When he finally picked up the phone, his hand trembled slightly. He noticed it, acknowledged it, then pressed call anyway. If he waited for courage to feel comfortable, this conversation would never happen. David answered on the third ring. What? His voice was flat, guarded, already braced for conflict. It's me, Harold said. I won't keep you long, I just need to talk. A sharp exhale came through the line. I don't think this is a good idea. Maybe not, Harold replied calmly, but I owe you this. Silence stretched between them, tense and brittle. Finally, David spoke again. Say what you need to say. Harold closed his eyes. I've been thinking a lot, he began, about the past, about where I failed you. His throat tightened, but he didn't stop. I wasn't always fair. I said things when you were younger that came from frustration, not care. I should have apologized back then. I didn't. That was wrong. David didn't respond. I'm not saying this to excuse anything, Harold continued. I just want you to know I see it now. I'm sorry for the hurt I caused and for the times I chose pride over listening. The quiet on the other end felt heavy, loaded. When David finally spoke, his voice was colder than before. You think saying sorry fixes everything? No, Harold said. I don't, I just think it's a start. David let out a short, bitter laugh. You always talk like that, like you're offering peace but it's still on your terms. That's not what I'm doing, Harold replied. I'm asking you to tell me what you've been carrying all these years. I don't even know where to begin, David snapped. Try, Harold said softly, please. Another pause, longer this time. Harold could almost hear David wrestling with something he'd kept locked away. When he spoke again, the edge in his voice had shifted into something raw. You never trusted me, David said. Not really. Every decision I made, you questioned it. Every mistake, I felt like you were waiting for it. That wasn't my intention, Harold said quickly. I know, David cut in, but intention doesn't change how it felt. His voice rose slightly. Even as an adult, it was the same. Advice I didn't ask for. Silence when I needed support. I felt like I was still trying to prove myself to you at 40 years old. Harold absorbed the words, each one landing hard. I thought I was helping, he said quietly. I know you did, David replied, but you never saw me as capable on my own. Laura sees that. She hates how small you make me feel. The mention of Laura stung, but Harold didn't interrupt. So that's what this is about, he said. You protecting that feeling. Yes, David said immediately, because I'm tired of feeling like I'm not enough. Harold swallowed, the realization settling deep. I never meant to make you feel that way, he said, but I can't change what you felt. I can only tell you I'm trying to understand now. David didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower, less certain. Understanding doesn't erase years of resentment. I know, Harold said, and I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. The line stayed quiet. Harold waited, resisting the urge to fill the space. Finally, David spoke again, slower now. I don't know what I want, he admitted. I just know I'm angry and tired. That's fair, Harold replied. All I wanted was to stop pretending nothing was wrong. The conversation wound down after that, neither of them willing or able to take it further. No apologies were accepted. No invitations were extended. When David said goodbye, it wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. As the call ended, Harold sat back, exhaustion washing over him. Nothing had been fixed, but something had shifted. For the first time, he felt like his son had actually heard him. The days after the call passed more slowly than Harold expected. There was no dramatic fallout, no follow-up message from David, just silence. At first, that silence unsettled him. He replayed the conversation again and again, dissecting every pause, every shift in tone, wondering if he'd said too much or not enough. But as the week unfolded, something else took its place. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. Healing, Harold realized, wasn't a moment. It wasn't an apology neatly received or a door suddenly reopened. It was uncomfortable, uneven, and painfully slow. Forgiveness, on either side, wouldn't come overnight, and pretending otherwise had only made things worse before. So he stopped waiting. Instead of pacing the house, he forced himself back into routines he'd abandoned without noticing. One morning, he pulled his old toolbox from the garage and spent hours fixing a loose cabinet hinge that had been bothering him for years. Another afternoon, he dusted off his guitar, his fingers clumsy at first as they found familiar chords. The music didn't erase anything, but it reminded him of a version of himself that existed outside of fatherhood and failure. Samantha checked in often. Sometimes they talked about David, sometimes they didn't. She told him about her work, her neighbors, the small frustrations of daily life. Harold listened, genuinely listened, and found comfort in being needed without being judged. The isolation that had wrapped itself around him after Christmas began to loosen, thread by thread. Still, certain thoughts lingered. Laura's name surfaced more than once in his mind. Harold considered calling her, imagined what he might say, how he might sound. But each time he stopped short. He wasn't ready, not yet. Facing her meant reopening wounds that hadn't even scabbed over. For now, restraint felt wiser than regret. One afternoon, Mark stopped by with coffee. They sat on the back porch, the winter air sharp but clean. Harold told him about the call with David, about the things that had been said, and the things that hadn't. "You did what you could," Mark said. "The rest isn't in your control." "I keep thinking I should do more," Harold admitted. Mark shook his head. "You spent years doing more. Maybe now it's time to do differently." He paused, then added, "Peace can't depend on someone else changing first." The words stayed with Harold long after Mark left. That night he lay in bed, staring into the dark, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not hope exactly, but resolve. He began taking small steps that had nothing to do with David. He signed up for a woodworking class at the community center. He started walking in the mornings again, letting the quiet streets ground him. Each choice felt insignificant on its own, but together they formed a quiet declaration. His life was still his. And yet beneath the progress, a question lingered. Was this healing, or was it preparation? Harold didn't know. What he did know was that waiting for reconciliation had cost him years he couldn't get back. If it came, he would meet it honestly. If it didn't, he refused to disappear in its absence. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the sun dip below the rooftops, his phone buzzed on the table. He didn't reach for it right away. He let it sit there, vibrating once before going still. Whatever came next, Harold knew one thing for certain. He was finally learning how to stand on his own again. The message arrived late in the evening, quiet and unassuming, yet it stopped Harold cold. His phone buzzed once on the coffee table, the screen lighting up the dim room. He hadn't been expecting anything, especially not this. "We need to talk. David." Harold read it twice, then a third time. No apology, no explanation, just 4 words that carried more weight than pages of conversation ever had. His first instinct was caution. He'd learned that hope, when raised too quickly, could collapse just as fast. This could be another argument, another attempt to draw lines instead of erase them. Still, he typed back a single word. "Okay." They agreed to meet the next afternoon at a small cafe halfway between their homes. Neutral ground. Harold arrived early, choosing a table near the window. He watched cars pass, hands folded around a cooling cup of coffee, his chest tight with uncertainty. When David finally walked in, Harold almost didn't recognize him. His son looked older than he remembered, shoulders tense, eyes tired, confidence low. Aren thin around the edges. David spotted him and hesitated, just for a second, before walking over. "Dad," he said. "David." They sat in silence for a moment, the clatter of dishes and low conversation filling the gaps neither of them rushed to close. David stared at the table, jaw set, as if bracing himself. "I've been thinking a lot," David began finally. His voice lacked the defensiveness Harold had grown used to. "About everything." Harold nodded, but didn't speak. He had learned the value of letting the silence do the work. "I was wrong," David said, the words coming out stiff, unfamiliar. He looked up now, meeting Harold's eyes. "The way I handled Christmas, the call, all of it." Harold felt something shift inside him, subtle but powerful. He kept his voice steady. "That wasn't easy to say." "No," David agreed quietly. "It was." David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together. "I let things spiral," he continued. "Laura was angry, and instead of standing my ground, I used her feelings as a shield. It was easier to push you away than deal with the tension at home." The admission hung between them. Harold listened, absorbing each word without interruption. "I told myself I was protecting my family," David said. "But really I was protecting myself, my pride, my comfort." He shook his head. "And I hurt you in the process." Harold studied his son's face, the tightness around his eyes, the strain in his posture. This wasn't rehearsed. This was exhaustion giving way to honesty. "I don't blame Laura for everything," David added. "I let her pressure get to me. I let old resentments fuel decisions I should have handled like a man. Harold's hands tightened slightly around his cup, but he didn't look away. Why now? He asked gently. David swallowed. Because after our call, I couldn't shake it. You didn't argue. You didn't attack. You listened. And it made me realize how long it's been since I did the same. The words landed heavier than an apology ever could. Harold felt the years between them, missteps, silences, pride, compress into that single moment. I want to fix this, David said, his voice rough. I don't know how, I don't even know where to start, but I don't want things to stay like this. Harold said nothing at first. He let the truth of it settle. The past couldn't be rewritten. No amount of regret could undo it. But sitting there across from his son, Harold understood something clearly for the first time. Holding onto anger wouldn't protect him anymore. I can't change what happened, Harold said slowly. Neither of us can, but I won't pretend I didn't hear what you just said. David's shoulders sagged, relief flickering across his face. So, where does that leave us? Harold met his gaze, steady and calm. It leaves us here, he said, with a choice. David waited. I forgive you, Harold said. The words came without hesitation, surprising even himself. Not because it was okay, but because I don't want the past deciding the rest of my life. David's eyes glistened, and he looked away quickly, nodding once. Thank you, he muttered. They sat there a while longer, not fixing everything, not planning the future, just existing in the fragile space forgiveness had opened. When they finally stood to leave, the air between them felt different, lighter, uncertain but real. As Harold walked to his car, his phone buzzed again in his pocket. He didn't check it right away. Forgiveness was a beginning, but beginnings were fragile. The change didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, careful movements like testing ice after a long winter. David began calling Harold every few days, sometimes with a reason, sometimes without one. They talked about ordinary things, work, traffic, old movies they both remembered. Neither of them rushed toward the past. For now, it was enough to stay in the present without flinching. When they met, it was usually brief. A walk through the neighborhood, coffee at the same cafe where they'd last spoken honestly. Harold noticed how David listened now, really listened, instead of waiting for his turn to speak. It didn't erase the years of distance, but it changed the shape of it. At home, Laura watched the shift with narrowed eyes. She didn't object outright, but her skepticism lingered. David sensed it and for once didn't avoid the conversation. One night, after the house had gone quiet, he told her everything. How he'd handled Christmas, how he'd used her anger as justification, how he'd hurt his father to protect his own pride. I was wrong, David said, and I let you carry that with me. Laura didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her voice was tight. I didn't ask you to shut him out like that. I know, David replied, but I let it happen. I need you to know that. Something in his honesty softened her, not completely, but enough. She saw the change in him, the steadier voice, the willingness to confront instead of deflect. It unsettled her, but it also orked her to reflect on her own rigidity. Meanwhile, Harold kept his distance without disappearing. He answered calls, accepted invitations when offered, but never assumed more than what was given. The peace he felt was fragile, built on acceptance rather than expectation. For the first time in years, he wasn't measuring his worth by David's approval. When the invitation finally came, it was simple. Would you like to come over for dinner this Friday? David asked. Just us. Harold paused before answering. He understood what it represented, a test, a risk, a chance to lose ground if handled poorly. I'd like that, he said. The evening arrived with a familiar knot in his chest. He stood at the door longer than necessary, straightening his jacket, steadying his breath. When Laura opened it, her smile was polite but guarded. Hi, Harold, she said. Laura, he replied, matching her tone. The dinner itself was careful. Conversation stayed close to neutral territory at first, work schedules, neighborhood changes, the weather. Harold watched the dynamic quietly, noticing how David navigated the space between them with intention, refusing to retreat into old habits. At one point, Laura brought out the food and hesitated, then set a plate in front of Harold herself. It was a small gesture, easily missed. Harold noticed it immediately. As the evening went on, the tension eased just enough to allow something genuine through. A shared laugh, a moment of agreement, nothing dramatic, nothing forced, just proof that the air could still clear. Harold felt something loosen inside him. He didn't mistake the dinner for resolution. He knew better, but it was the first time he'd been invited into their home without conditions, without resentment hanging openly in the room. When he left, Laura thanked him for coming. Her voice lacked warmth, but it also lacked hostility. For now, that was enough. Driving home, Harold reflected on how far they'd come, and how far they still had to go. This wasn't forgiveness wrapped in celebration. It was progress measured in inches, not miles. As he pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed with a message from David. "Thank you for tonight." Harold sat in the car for a moment, the engine idling softly. It wasn't the ending he once imagined, but it was a beginning he was willing to protect. The weeks that followed unfolded without drama, and in that quiet, Harold learned how different healing felt from forgiveness. Forgiveness had been a decision. Healing was a discipline. It required patience, restraint, and the willingness to accept progress that came without certainty. David called regularly now, not out of obligation but habit. Their conversations were more honest, though still careful. When disagreements surfaced, neither rushed to win. They paused, listened, and sometimes left things unfinished. Harold noticed how strange that felt, how unfamiliar it was to allow space instead of forcing resolution. Time with his grandchildren changed him the most. The first afternoon they spent together, Harold sat on the living room floor, building a puzzle while they argued over missing pieces. Their laughter filled the room, unguarded and loud, and something in his chest eased. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was present, needed, grounded. David and Laura began extending invitations again, birthdays, short weekend visits, small gatherings where expectations were low. Trust was being rebuilt cautiously, brick by brick. Laura remained reserved, but Harold saw the effort beneath it. She listened more than she spoke now, watching instead of resisting. It wasn't warmth, but it was intention. Harold didn't mistake kindness for resolution. He understood that some fractures never fully disappear. The relationship he once imagined with his son, easy, unquestioned, was gone. In its place stood something more fragile but more honest. That understanding didn't bring sadness. It brought clarity. There were still moments when old feelings surfaced, a comment that landed wrong, a silence that stretched too long. Harold felt them when they came, acknowledged them, and let them pass. Growth, he realized, wasn't about pretending pain no longer existed. It was about not letting it steer. One evening, after a family gathering, Harold stood in the doorway of David's home, watching his son laugh with his children. The sight stirred pride and grief in equal measure. He had missed years he couldn't reclaim, but he was here now. Later that night, alone in his house, Harold sat by the window with the lights dimmed. He thought about everything that had changed, and everything that hadn't. The past still lived with him, but it no longer defined him. Peace, he discovered, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, in shared meals, in small apologies, in moments that asked for nothing more than presence. He knew there was more work ahead, conversations still waiting, truths still unspoken. Healing didn't follow a straw. Line and patience would be tested again. But as Harold looked toward the darkened street outside, he felt something steady beneath the uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel closed. It felt possible. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded quietly, in conversations that ended too soon, in expressions that lingered a second longer than they should have. Harold had made his choice, to confront the past, to forgive without forgetting, and now the weight of that decision moved through the family like a slow current, touching everyone in different ways. David felt it first. The effort of trying to be better pressed on him daily. Old habits didn't loosen easily, and guilt had a way of resurfacing when he least expected it. At work, he found his focus slipping. At home, he caught himself retreating into silence, unsure whether speaking would heal or reopen wounds. The knowledge that he had hurt his father, intentionally or not, sat heavy in his chest, especially now that Harold was no longer pushing, no longer demanding anything from him. That restraint unsettled David more than anger ever had. Victoria noticed the strain immediately. Family gatherings had resumed, but the atmosphere was different, careful, measured. She tried to smooth over awkward moments, filling silences with questions, steering conversations away from old landmines. But mediation had its limits. When she suggested they all sit down and talk openly, David bristled. "Not everything needs to be dissected," he said sharply. Victoria backed off, frustration flickering across her face. She carried the weight of wanting peace without knowing how to create it. Every attempt felt like walking a narrow bridge, one misstep away from another fracture. Douglas had his opinions, as he always did. Over coffee one afternoon, he told David that time would fix everything, that fathers and sons always found their way back to each other. His advice was well-meaning but hollow. David nodded politely, knowing Douglas didn't understand the years of silence, the pride that had calcified into resentment. Simplifying it only made the distance feel wider. With Harold, David tried harder, but not harder enough. He called. He checked in. But when conversations edged toward deeper territory, his defenses rose instinctively. Pride still guarded him, whispering that admitting too much would make him small. Harold sensed it, too, the effort paired with restraint, the apology that stopped short of vulnerability. Harold, for his part, found himself questioning everything. In the quiet moments, he wondered whether his confrontation had pushed David too far, whether stepping back now looked like indifference instead of respect. He replayed his words, measured his silences, searching for signs that he'd misjudged the balance between guidance and control. Had he been too harsh? Or had that firmness been necessary for David to finally see himself clearly? The doubt crept in during the evenings when the house grew still and memory filled the gaps. Harold reminded himself why he'd chosen honesty over avoidance, why he'd stopped carrying guilt that wasn't his alone. Growth, he knew, rarely came without discomfort. Still, the tension was undeniable. At the next family gathering, it surfaced plainly. A harmless comment about the past landed wrong. David stiffened. Harold noticed and said nothing. Victoria watched the exchange, her smile tightening. The room didn't erupt, but it didn't relax either. The unspoken pressed in from all sides. Later that night, David stood alone on the back porch, staring into the dark. Harold watched him through the window, considering whether to step outside, whether to bridge the distance or let David sit with his thoughts. He stayed where he was. Not every silence needed to be filled. Inside, Harold felt the weight of the moment settle. The family was changing, whether they were ready or not. Old dynamics were breaking apart and nothing solid had fully replaced them yet. That space, between what was and what could be, was uncomfortable, unstable. And it was exactly where they all stood now. As Harold turned off the lights and prepared for bed, his phone buzzed softly on the table. He glanced at the screen but didn't pick it up right away. Some conversations, he knew, carried consequences long after they ended. David made the call late one night, after the house had gone quiet and the familiar doubts crept back in. He stared at the contact name for a long moment before pressing dial, unsure how the conversation would even begin. This wasn't someone he'd leaned on before. In fact, it was someone he'd spent years keeping at arm's length. When the voice answered, steady and unguarded, David felt something loosen in his chest. "I don't know who else to talk to," David admitted after a brief exchange. "I've made a mess of things." The ally listened without interrupting, letting David lay it all out. The anger, the pride, the regret, the fear that he'd waited too long to fix what mattered most. When David finished, there was no judgment in the response, only a measured calm. "You don't rebuild a relationship by saying the right things," the ally said. "You do it by showing up differently, consistently." David exhaled. That was what he'd been missing, not intention but action. Over the next few days, David followed the advice he'd been given. He changed his schedule to make time he couldn't cancel. He stopped defending himself before anyone accused him. The shift was subtle but real. He reached out to Harold without an agenda, asked questions without steering the answers, listened without rushing to explain himself. Harold noticed, and it made him uneasy. The change felt too smooth, too deliberate. David's calls were steadier now, his tone measured. Where there had once been distance or defensiveness, there was patience. Harold couldn't decide whether to be relieved or wary. Experience had taught him that sudden improvements often carried hidden motives. Victoria, on the other hand, saw hope. She watched David take responsibility in small but telling ways, owning his mistakes without being prompted, stepping in when tension rose instead of stepping back. "He's trying," she told Harold one afternoon. "Really trying." Harold nodded but didn't commit. "Trying and changing aren't the same thing," he said. His skepticism hardened into quiet resistance. Pride whispered that he'd seen this before, temporary effort, followed by retreat. Accepting David's growth too easily felt dangerous, like lowering a guard he'd only just learned to raise. Meanwhile, the unexpected ally gave David something tangible, an opportunity to prove himself. It wasn't a favor and it wasn't easy. It required commitment, humility, and a willingness to fail publicly if things went wrong. The catch was clear: no shortcuts, no excuses. If David wanted credibility, he'd have to earn it. David agreed without hesitation. When Harold learned about the opportunity, he dismissed it immediately. "People don't change because someone gives them a chance," he said to Victoria. "They change because they have to." But then came the revelation. One evening, Harold received a call from the ally himself. The conversation began politely, cautiously, until the truth emerged, details David had never shared, burdens he'd carried quietly for years, decisions he'd made to protect others at his own expense. The ally didn't defend David blindly. He spoke plainly, acknowledging David's failures while revealing the effort behind the scenes. "You may not see it yet," the ally said, "but your son is doing the work." The call ended, leaving Harold alone with information he hadn't asked for and couldn't ignore. It unsettled him more than confrontation ever had. The narrative he'd held onto, the one that kept his expectations low and his heart guarded, no longer fit as cleanly. Still, pride lingered. Letting go of doubt meant risking disappointment again. David took his next step carefully. He didn't announce it. He didn't seek approval. He simply acted, making a decision that aligned with the values he'd been claiming all along, even though it cost him something tangible. When Harold found out, it stopped him short. For the first time, the effort didn't feel performative. Harold sat with the realization longer than he wanted to admit. Change, real change, was inconvenient. It challenged the comfort of certainty. And yet the evidence was there, building quietly. When David called that night, Harold answered without hesitation. The conversation was brief, unremarkable on the surface. But beneath it, something shifted again, subtle, uncertain, undeniable. It wasn't forgiveness, but it might have been the beginning of belief. The opportunity arrived disguised as momentum. David had been building toward it for years, quietly, deliberately. But now that it was finally within reach, it felt less like a reward and more like a reckoning. One wrong decision could undo everything he'd worked for. One misstep could confirm every doubt he'd ever carried about himself. When he told Harold about it, he didn't oversell it. He laid out the facts plainly, the investment, the timeline, the exposure. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for connections. He asked for one thing only. "I want you to know what I'm doing," David said, "before it happens." Harold listened in silence, his face unreadable. The instinct to intervene rose quickly, familiar and sharp. He saw the risks immediately. Too much leverage, too much uncertainty. The kind of situation where confidence could become arrogance overnight. "I'll support you," Harold said finally, "but only if you do this on your own." David stiffened. "I am doing it on my own." "No," Harold replied calmly. "I mean completely. No safety nets. No rescuing. If this works, it's yours. If it fails," he paused. "You live with that too." The words landed heavier than ink. Or Ridgeman ever could. David nodded slowly. "That's fair." Victoria wasn't so sure. Later that evening, she pulled Harold aside, her concern clear. "You're being too distant," she said. "He needs to know you believe in him." "I do," Harold replied. "That's why I'm not stepping in." She studied him, uncertain but hopeful. "Just don't confuse caution with punishment." David felt the pressure immediately. The closer the deal moved toward reality, the louder the doubts became. Late nights stretched longer. Sleep came in fragments. He questioned his instincts, replayed worst-case scenarios, imagined the quiet disappointment he'd see on Harold's face if everything collapsed. But beneath the fear was something else: resolve. This wasn't about proving his father wrong. It was about proving himself right. As negotiations intensified, the stakes rose quickly. Unexpected costs surfaced. Timelines tightened. Partners hesitated. Each complication forced David to choose between retreat and risk. He adjusted where he could, held firm where he had to. The margin for error shrank with every decision. Then came the obstacle he hadn't planned for. A key partner backed out at the last moment, taking critical resources with them. The deal wobbled, suddenly fragile. Advisors urged David to delay, to reconsider, to protect what he already had. Walking away now would sting, but it wouldn't destroy him. David sat alone in his office that night, staring at the city lights below. He thought about Harold's condition. No rescue, no interference, just accountability. He made the call. The decision cost him more than money. It demanded credibility he'd never risked before. The leap forward came without guarantees, without applause. Only the quiet certainty that backing out now would haunt him longer than failure ever could. Word spread quickly. The family felt it immediately. Victoria watched the news closely, anxiety etched into her expression. Harold said little, but his silence carried weight. He knew how close the edge was. He also knew this was the moment David had been moving toward, whether consciously or not. The days that followed were tense. No one spoke openly about outcomes, but everyone felt the gravity of what was unfolding. David stayed focused, addressing problems as they came, absorbing pressure without deflecting it. When setbacks hit, he didn't hide them. He adjusted. He stayed present. Harold observed from a distance, resisting the urge to step in. This was harder than confrontation had ever been. Letting go always was. Then came the waiting. Decisions made, contracts submitted, outcomes pending. The silence between updates stretched thin. Every unanswered call, every delayed response carried possibility and threat. The family gathered one evening, the tension unspoken but unmistakable. David sat quietly, hands folded, eyes steady. Harold watched him closely, seeing something he hadn't seen before. Not defiance. Ownership. As night fell, David's phone buzzed on the table. He didn't reach for it immediately. No one did. The room seemed to hold its breath. Whatever the outcome, nothing would be the same after this. The morning came too quickly. David sat in his office, staring at the mountain of papers in front of him. Each one was a decision, a calculation, a promise made. He had spent months, years, building up to this point, but now that it was finally here, the weight of it was crushing. The business venture he had bet everything on had reached its tipping point. This wasn't just about success anymore. This was about survival. One decision now could either solidify his future or destroy everything he had worked for. Harold, as always, was watching from the sidelines. He hadn't offered advice in weeks, but David could feel the tension in his silence. His father had given him the space he asked for, but David knew that this moment would be the true test of whether Harold believed he could succeed on his own. If David failed, it wouldn't just be a financial loss. It would be a blow to the fragile trust they had begun to rebuild. The weight of Harold's expectations, unspoken but heavy, pressed down on him. Victoria, too, had become a quiet observer. She had been supportive from the start, but now, as the risks mounted, her optimism began to fade. She had always believed in David, but as the stakes grew higher, she felt the pull of doubt. She tried to stay hopeful for his sake, but the fear in her eyes couldn't be hidden. "I'm here no matter what happens," she said to him late one night, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "But David, this is huge." David nodded, though he could feel her uncertainty like a shadow behind him. He wasn't blind to the strain. She had always believed in him, but belief couldn't change the facts in front of them. The business was teetering on the edge, and he couldn't escape the reality that one wrong move would bring it all crashing down. The tipping point arrived suddenly, like a gust of wind that knocks over a house of cards. A critical deal fell through. The partner he'd been counting on pulled out without warning, leaving him with a hole in his finances and a deadline fast approaching. The air in the office felt thick with panic, the walls closing in as David weighed his options. He could attempt to salvage what remained, but it would mean doubling down on everything he had left. Or he could walk away now, take the losses, and cut his ties before the damage became irreversible. David's hands clenched around the desk, his breath shallow. This was it. The decision he had been postponing, the one he'd known was coming, was finally here. He could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioner in the background, the faint noise of traffic outside. But all of it felt distant now, irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the choice in front of him. As the hours passed, David called every contact he had left. He sought out advice, reassurance, hoping someone could give him the answer he was searching for. But everyone was either too invested or too cautious to offer anything concrete. He was alone, with nothing but his own judgment and the pressure of the situation. Meanwhile, Harold sat at home, aware that something was shifting even if he didn't fully understand it. The phone calls had stopped coming as often, the updates less frequent. He'd given David space, but as the tension mounted, he began to feel the gravity of the situation more acutely. There had been a time when he would have stepped in, when he would have offered help, advice, or even just a presence to guide David. But now he knew better. This was David's fight, and the outcome was something only he could control. Still, Harold couldn't help but feel that this moment would define everything they had worked toward. If David succeeded, maybe they would both be free of the past. If he failed, everything they'd rebuilt would crumble again. As the day wore on, Harold's thoughts began to shift. He had been stubborn for so long, holding on to the belief that David had to prove himself on his own, that he had to carry the weight of his own mistakes without help. But something in Harold softened. He saw the way David was wrestling with this decision, not out of fear, but because he understood the magnitude of it. David wasn't just playing for a chance at success. He was playing for his own redemption, for the future he had longed for but never knew how to build. David called him just as the evening began to fall, the sky outside darkening with the weight of unspoken words. "I need to make this decision, Dad," David said, his voice quiet but steady. "But I can't do it alone, not this time." Harold took a breath, the words coming slower than they should have. "I won't tell you what to do," he said, his voice still firm but less cold than it had been in the past. "But I'll tell you this. You've been handling this on your own for a long time. You don't need to carry it alone anymore." David stayed silent for a moment, then said, "I'm going for it. I'm taking the risk." Harold's heart tightened, and for the first time in months, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. David was taking ownership, not just of the decision, but of the consequences as well. Harold didn't know if it would work out, but he finally understood that it wasn't about the outcome. It was about David's willingness to fight for it, to not back down even when everything seemed to be falling apart. The call ended without any promises, but with a quiet understanding between them. Harold didn't know how this would unfold. The tension was still there, thick and palpable as the weight of the decision loomed. But as he stood by the window, staring into the gathering dark, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, David had finally stepped into the life he had been too afraid to claim. And Harold, though still cautious, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The outcome of David's decision remained unclear, the stakes as high as ever. But one thing was certain: the future was no longer defined by the past. The fallout didn't explode the way Harold once imagined it might. It arrived slowly in fragments: missed calls, tense updates, long pauses where certainty should have been. David's decision had been made, the leap taken, and now the consequences were unfolding in real time, indifferent to hope or intention. The business didn't collapse outright, but it didn't stabilize either. Problems surfaced one after another, each demanding attention, each draining more energy than the last. David worked longer hours than ever, his face drawn tight with fatigue when Harold saw him. There was no triumph in his posture, no false confidence, only effort. Harold watched closely. He had expected frustration, maybe even bitterness, but what unsettled him most was David's persistence. When obstacles appeared, David didn't blame anyone. He didn't deflect. He adjusted, took responsibility, and kept moving. It wasn't graceful. It was hard and often clumsy, but it was honest. That honesty shook something loose in Harold. Pride had always been his armor, belief in discipline, self-reliance, control. Watching David struggle without quitting forced Harold to confront an uncomfortable truth. Growth didn't always look like success. Sometimes it looked like endurance. Victoria felt the strain of it all most acutely. She moved between father and son, absorbing tension, translating moods, holding conversations together when they threatened to fall apart. One evening, after David left abruptly to take another call, she turned to Harold, exhaustion plain on her face. "He's trying," she said, "in ways he never did before." Harold didn't argue, he couldn't. "Trying doesn't guarantee anything," he replied quietly. "No," Victoria agreed, "but it means something." David, for his part, didn't ask for sympathy. When setbacks came, he owned them openly. "This was my call," he said more than once. "I knew the risks." There was no self-pity in his voice, only accountability. Redemption, he understood now, wasn't a declaration. It was a process. Late one night, Harold found himself replaying moments he'd dismissed for years. The way he'd measured success, the standards he'd imposed without explanation. He recognized the fear beneath it all: fear of weakness, fear of failure, fear of being responsible for someone else's collapse. Forgiving David fully meant letting go of that fear. The family finally gathered to take stock of where things stood. Not a celebration, not an intervention, just a reckoning. David spoke plainly about what had gone wrong, what remained uncertain, and what he was doing to fix it. He didn't ask for reassurance. He didn't soften the reality. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. Harold broke the silence. "You're carrying this differently," he said. "It wasn't praise, it was recognition." David nodded once. "I have to." That moment, small, unremarkable on the surface, shifted something between them. Harold saw not the son he'd once tried to shape, but the man standing in front of him, imperfect and accountable. Later, as the evening wound down, Harold and David found themselves alone in the kitchen. The tension hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt hostile. "I don't know how this ends," David said quietly. I just know I won't run from it." Harold studied him, searching for the familiar defensiveness. It wasn't there. "Neither do I," he admitted, "but I see the difference." They stood there for a moment longer, not fixing anything, not promising anything, just sharing the weight of uncertainty. For Harold, the reckoning wasn't just about David's choices. It was about his own, how much of his resistance had been protection, and how much had been pride. As he drove home that night, the question stayed with him. Was he ready to forgive completely, or was he still afraid of what forgiveness demanded? The answer didn't come easily, and the future, like everything else now, remained unresolved. David didn't plan the confrontation carefully. That, more than anything, told Harold how serious it was. There was no build-up, no warning, just a call asking if they could talk, really talk. Harold agreed before he could think himself out of it. They met at Harold's house, the same place where so many conversations had ended unfinished. Victoria arrived with David but stayed back, lingering near the kitchen, close enough to hear raised voices, far enough to give them space. She sensed what this was, not another discussion, a reckoning. David stood in the living room, hands clenched at his sides. "I can't keep doing this halfway," he said. "I need to know where we stand." Harold felt the weight of the words settle into his chest. "This isn't easy for me either," he replied. "I know," David said sharply, "but it's never been easy, that's the problem." The room felt smaller as the silence closed in. David took a breath, steadying himself. "I've admitted my mistakes. I've taken responsibility, but I still feel like I'm standing trial every time we talk." Harold bristled. "You think accountability is punishment?" "No," David shot back. "I think you don't know how to let go." The accusation landed hard. Harold opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Images surfaced, missed moments, harsh words, expectations he'd never explained. He felt the familiar urge to defend himself rise, but something held him back. "You don't understand what it cost me," Harold said finally. "Watching you make choices I knew could hurt you." "And you don't understand what it cost me," David replied, voice breaking. "Feeling like I was never enough unless I did things your way." Victoria shifted in the doorway, heart pounding. This was the edge she'd feared, the place where honesty cut without mercy. "I needed you to believe in me," David continued. "Not conditionally, not after I proved something, just believe." Harold's throat tightened. He looked at his son and for the first time saw the years he'd missed, not physically, but emotionally. "I thought pushing you would make you stronger," he said. "I didn't realize how alone it made you feel." David shook his head. "That loneliness stayed with me, even now." The words stripped away what little defense Harold had left. Regret surged up, raw and unfiltered. "I failed you," he said quietly, "in ways I didn't want to see." The admission changed the air in the room. David's anger faltered, replaced by exhaustion. "I'm not asking you to erase the past," he said. "I just need to know it won't control the future." Harold wanted to say yes, wanted to promise everything would be different, but fear tightened its grip. Forgiving fully meant accepting uncertainty, accepting that David might fail again, and that Harold wouldn't step in to prevent it. "I'm trying," Harold said honestly, "but letting go of the past feels like losing the only map I ever had." David nodded slowly, "And holding onto it is killing us both." The confrontation reached its peak there. No shouting, no slammed doors, just two men standing exposed, stripped of roles and defenses. Victoria watched, tears gathering, unsure whether she was witnessing healing or the final fracture. David took a step back. "I needed to say this," he said. "Whatever happens next, I needed you to hear me." Harold nodded, his chest heavy. "I hear you." They stood there, unsure what the words meant in practice. No embrace followed, no clear resolution, just the acknowledgement that something irrevocable had been said. As David turned to leave, he paused at the door. "I hope this is the beginning," he said, but I can't keep waiting forever. The door closed softly behind him. Harold remained where he was, the house suddenly too quiet. A decision had been made, not spoken aloud but felt. The old way could not continue. Something had to change. What that change would cost them both remained painfully unclear. After the confrontation, nothing dramatic happened. No sudden closeness. No clean relief. Life simply resumed, quieter than before but heavier. David returned to his routines with a different posture, less defensive, more deliberate. He stopped talking about what he meant to do and focused instead on what needed to be done, one decision at a time. He rebuilt from the inside out. He showed up early. He followed through. When problems surfaced, he didn't look for someone else to steady him. He absorbed the pressure and adjusted. The business remained unstable, but David no longer treated uncertainty like an enemy. He treated it like responsibility. Harold watched all of this from a careful distance. Part of him wanted to step in, to offer guidance the way he always had. Another part knew that doing so now would undo everything David was trying to build. Pride and restraint wrestled quietly inside him. Helping felt loving. Holding back felt necessary. Victoria stayed between them, gently but persistently. She didn't push for big conversations or emotional breakthroughs. Instead, she encouraged small steps, shared meals, brief check-ins, moments that didn't demand resolution. Progress doesn't have to be loud, she reminded them both. It just has to be real. David took that to heart. He didn't force closeness with Harold. He respected the distance even when it hurt. When he did reach out, it was simple. No justifications. No rehearsed apologies, just presence. Harold noticed the change even when he pretended not to. David listened now without bracing. He asked questions without steering the answers. When Harold spoke about the past, David didn't argue. He acknowledged it and then let it rest. That restraint unsettled Harold more than confrontation ever had. The wounds were still there. Certain words still triggered old defenses. Certain silences still felt dangerous. Harold found himself pulling back at times, retreating into habits he'd worn for decades. But slowly he began to open again, carefully, unevenly, honestly. One afternoon, Harold admitted something he'd never said out loud. "I didn't know how to be soft without feeling weak," he said. David didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was steady. "I didn't know how to be strong without feeling alone." The words hung between them, fragile and exposed. They didn't fix anything, but they shifted something. The family took tentative steps forward. Short gatherings, neutral conversations, moments where laughter surfaced unexpectedly, then faded without being questioned. No one pretended the past was gone. They simply stopped letting it dominate every room. David continued to grow, not perfectly, not quickly, but consistently. He accepted consequences without resentment. He made decisions with clarity instead of impulse. Responsibility no longer felt like punishment to him. It felt earned. Harold saw it clearly now. The man his son was becoming wasn't the one he'd tried to mold years ago. And that realization brought both pride and grief. Pride for what David was becoming. Grief for the years they'd spent missing each other. The breakthrough came quietly. One evening, Harold found himself calling David, not because something was wrong, but because something needed to be shared. A memory, a thought, a moment of vulnerability that would have once felt unnecessary. David listened, didn't interrupt, didn't rush to respond. When the call ended, Harold sat with the unfamiliar feeling of having been heard without resistance. It wasn't forgiveness finalized, it wasn't closure, but it was movement. Both men understood the truth now. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a road, long, uneven, demanding patience from both sides. There would be setbacks. There would be days when old patterns threatened to return. But for the first time, neither of them was walking alone. And that, even in its uncertainty, felt like progress worth protecting. Healing didn't announce itself with relief or celebration. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, in the way Harold and David started trusting small moments again. A returned call, a promise kept, an apology that didn't come with an explanation attached. None of it erased the past, but it softened the edges enough for something new to take hold. Victoria understood this rhythm better than anyone. She stayed close, offering support when the tension rose, but she also knew when to step back. She stopped trying to manage every interaction, stopped filling every silence. Healing, she believed, needed room to breathe. Too much pressure would only send them retreating into old habits. David continued to change, not in grand gestures but in consistency. He took responsibility without being asked. When mistakes surfaced, he named them plainly instead of defending himself. He followed through on commitments that once would have slipped through the cracks. These weren't performances. They cost him something, and Harold could see that. Still, Harold remained guarded. Trust didn't return simply because effort was visible. Years of disappointment had taught him caution. But every now and then he caught a glimpse of the son he once knew, the boy who listened intently, who carried quiet determination beneath his stubbornness. Those moments surprised him, unsettled him, and slowly they mattered. The family began reconnecting in careful increments, short visits, shared meals that didn't stretch too long, laughter that appeared unexpectedly, then faded without anyone calling attention to it, and yet the scars were still there. A careless comment could stiffen shoulders, a pause could reopen old questions. When that happened, no one pretended it didn't matter. They acknowledged. Edit then moved forward. One afternoon, Harold and Victoria found themselves alone after a gathering, the house finally quiet. The weight of the months behind them settled in. "I didn't know how to help without controlling," Victoria admitted softly. "I thought if I held everything together, it would heal faster." Harold nodded. "I didn't know how to love without setting conditions." The honesty lingered between them. For years, their relationship had revolved around managing conflict instead of addressing it. Now, without the chaos dominating every conversation, they were finally seeing each other clearly. "We did the best we could," Victoria said, "but we can do better now." Harold felt something ease inside him. Strengthening his bond with Victoria grounded him in ways he hadn't expected. It reminded him that healing wasn't only about David. It was about the entire family learning how to move differently. David noticed the shift, too. He felt less pressure to prove himself, more space to simply show up. That freedom didn't make him complacent. It made him deliberate. He understood now that progress didn't cancel responsibility. It demanded it. There were setbacks, days when old anger surfaced, moments when David felt judged despite his efforts, or when Harold felt the familiar urge to withdraw. But those moments no longer defined the relationship. They became part of it, acknowledged, worked through, then released. One evening, Harold watched David help his children with their homework, patient and attentive. The sight stirred a complicated mix of pride and regret. He had missed so much, but he was here now, witnessing something that mattered. David caught his eye and offered a small, uncertain smile. Harold returned it without thinking. It wasn't forgiveness sealed. It wasn't trust complete. But it was real. As the night settled in and the house grew quiet again, Harold sat alone, reflecting on how far they'd come, and how far they still had to go. Healing wasn't linear. It demanded patience, humility, and the willingness to stay present even when it hurt. The family was rebuilding, not into what it had once been, but into something more honest, stronger in ways that didn't rely on silence or control. And as Harold turned off the lights, he felt the familiar uncertainty stir again, not as fear but as awareness. Healing was happening, but it wasn't finished yet. The shift didn't feel dramatic. There was no single moment Harold could point to and say this is where everything changed. Instead, the new chapter arrived quietly, built from the accumulation of small choices made differently than before. Less defensiveness, more honesty, fewer assumptions about what the other person meant. Harold felt the change most clearly within himself. The weight he'd carried for years of regret, of certainty, of needing to be right, had begun to loosen. He no longer saw his past mistakes as accusations he had to outrun. They were simply truths he could acknowledge. That clarity gave him a freedom he hadn't expected. He started opening up to David in ways he never had, not with advice or warnings but with stories, failures, doubts he'd buried for decades. One afternoon, sitting on the back steps, Harold admitted something that surprised them both. "I didn't always know what I was doing," he said. "I just didn't want you to see that." David listened without interrupting. There was no resentment in his face now, only recognition. "I think that's what scared me most," he replied, "feeling like I had to live up to something impossible." That honesty didn't erase the past, but it softened it. Their conversations no longer felt like negotiations. They felt like exchanges, two people learning how to be present without armor. Victoria noticed the peace returning before either of them did. The tension that once dominated every gathering had eased into something manageable, not perfect, not carefree, but no longer sharp enough to cut. She continued to support both men, offering perspective when needed, but she no longer felt responsible for holding everything together. The family had begun to carry itself. David, too, stepped into something new. He stopped defining himself by his father's expectations, real or imagined, and focused instead on the life he was building. The business stabilized not spectacularly but steadily. More importantly, David's confidence no longer hinged on approval. It came from ownership. Harold watched from the sidelines, proud in a way that didn't demand recognition. For the first time, he wasn't tempted to intervene. He trusted David to navigate his own path, even if that path led somewhere unexpected. "I know we can't go back," Harold said one evening after a long pause between them. "What we had before, it's gone." David nodded. "I know. But that doesn't mean we can't move forward," Harold added, "just differently." David smiled faintly. "I'd like that." The quiet dinner that followed a week later felt symbolic in a way no one commented on. No guests, no celebration, just the family around the table, passing dishes, sharing stories that didn't tiptoe around old wounds but didn't reopen them either. The conversation flowed easily, with space for silence that didn't feel threatening. Harold looked around the table and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not pride, not relief, but acceptance. This was what progress looked like: uneven, unremarkable, real. As the night wound down, David cleared the table without being asked. Victoria watched, smiling to herself. Harold noticed too, not because it mattered but because it no longer needed to. Later, as Harold prepared to leave, David walked him to the door. They stood there for a moment, neither in a hurry. "I'm glad you're here," David said simply. Harold met his gaze. "So am I." Driving home, Harold reflected on the uncertainty that still lay ahead. There would be challenges, missteps, moments when old instincts threatened to return, but the difference now was choice. They were choosing to stay engaged, to listen, to adjust. The future wasn't guaranteed. It never had been. But as Harold pulled into his driveway, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a quiet, grounded hope. Not for perfection, not for redemption wrapped neatly in forgiveness. Just for continuity. A future built not on who they used to be, but on who they were becoming together. The walk began without a plan. Harold had suggested it casually, the way people do when they don't want to make something feel heavier than it already is. David agreed just as easily. They moved side by side down the familiar street, winter air cool and steady, the neighborhood quieter than usual. For a while neither of them spoke. The silence felt earned now, not strained. Harold listened to the rhythm of their steps, aware of how different this felt from the walks he'd taken alone not so long ago. Back then, silence had been a reminder of what he'd lost. Now it was space, room enough for reflection. I used to think forgiveness was weakness, David said finally, like letting someone off the hook. Harold nodded slowly. I thought it was surrender. David glanced at him. Turns out it's work. Harold let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. Harder work than holding a grudge. They walked on, memories surfacing naturally instead of being dragged out by guilt. They talked about mistakes, not just the big ones but the small decisions that had added up over years. Missed conversations, assumptions left unchallenged, pride mistaken for strength. I don't say this enough, David said, his voice steady but sincere. But thank you for not giving up on me, even when I made it easy to. Harold stopped walking. David did too, turning to face him. The moment felt important but not fragile. I didn't forgive you because it was easy, Harold said. I did it because carrying anger was costing me more than the hurt ever did. David swallowed, nodding. It changed everything for me. They resumed walking, the weight of the conversation settling gently rather than pressing down. When they returned, the house was already full. The family had gathered, not for a milestone or an announcement, but for something simpler, a celebration of being together without tension dictating every interaction. Laughter filled the room, conversations overlapped. The energy was different, not forced, not cautious, but grounded. Harold watched from his seat at the table, taking it in. This wasn't perfection, it was progress. Victoria caught his eye from across the room and smiled. Later, when the noise softened and people drifted into smaller conversations, she joined him near the window. I didn't know if we'd ever get here, she admitted quietly. Neither did I, Harold replied. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment and they stood there together, sharing a quiet pride that didn't need words. They had both made mistakes. Both learned when to hold on and when to step back. Healing hadn't come from control, it had come from release. Across the room, David spoke animatedly with relatives, his posture relaxed, his confidence no longer borrowed from anyone else. Harold noticed how he carried himself now, not defiant, not defensive, just sure. Later that evening, as plates were cleared and coats gathered, Harold felt something settle in his chest, a sense of continuity he hadn't expected to find again. The scars were still there. They always would be, but they no longer dictated every step forward. Before leaving, David pulled Harold aside. I know there will be setbacks, he said. I'm not pretending otherwise. Harold nodded, so will I. But whatever comes, David continued, I'm not running anymore. Harold met his gaze and saw the truth of it, not as a promise but as a decision. Neither am I. As the night wound down and the house grew quiet again, Harold stood at the door, watching his family move through the space THEs that once felt impossible. He understood now that legacy wasn't built through authority or sacrifice alone. It was built through repair, through choosing connection when distance felt safer. Outside, David waited. Together, they stepped into the cool night air, side by side, their shadows stretching ahead of them on the pavement. As they walked side by side, Harold and David knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but together they had finally begun to heal, a bond stronger than ever, built on the power of forgiveness and a new understanding of love.